Amen. Thank you, David. And welcome, church. And just for those who are doubting, it is me. It really is. And I went out last week to Carrefour and I bought a pair of trousers in celebration. So there are some things that change. Something else that changes, I've got notes. When I talk, I don't usually do notes, but in recognition of the fact that we've got a very knowledgeable audience, and this is a Bible study, right? We're going to be delving into the Word in some depth in one little area. I thought I'd get some notes because I don't want to go wrong. But something else doesn't change, which is sometimes I can ramble on and go on. So I was just wondering if somebody could let me know when it's 7 o'clock. Perhaps Dave, yeah, thanks. What about someone 7:30? Anybody volunteer for 7:30? Thank you at the back. Yeah, okay. No, seriously, this is a Wednesday evening Bible study. We will try and finish in Wednesday evening. So, so it's a sermon, I hope, by the Spirit, but it's a sermon that's going to look at 112 days in particular. 112 days. And the context of the 112 days, or the time, is the 29th of August to the 18th of December, 520 BCE, or BC, before Christ, before the Common Era, whatever you like. And there's a little verse at the bottom. And I'm not going to, at this moment, give any context. I'm not even going to tell you where it's from. It's a verse you probably know, not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit. Saith the Lord, yes, but we're going to unpack the events around that verse, and hopefully by the end of this evening, our goal I hope together, is we will understand something of the context, something of the historical setting into which those words were said. And so I'm just going to move on a little bit and we get a picture. And my question is, what is that? Does anybody know? Now, I know there were no great cameras around in those days. It's old, so this is a bit of an artist impression. But what is it? Any? The temple? Which temple? Not Solomon's. Not David's. It's the second temple, Zerubbabel's temple. The temple of Zerubbabel. And that might give you a little clue about where we're going tonight. So that's the temple of Zerubbabel. And we've got this up here, this slide. Now, I want to just explain, just very briefly, the people in the church have bonus content. The stuff up in the top left of the slide is usually just a bigger version of what's at the bottom. The people online only get to see the bottom. You, because you came into church, get to see the top bit, which is a bit bigger for the eyes. And it also, there's the odd little bit of bonus content in there as well. But I just want to start by looking into the book of Matthew and the book of Luke, the genealogy of Jesus. And we see that basically, they're the same from Abraham, or from Abraham through to David. Luke has from God through to Abraham that Matthew doesn't have, and they have them in reversed order. For the purpose of this slide, I have just reversed Luke, so as they go together. And they're the same until we get after David. And from David, we see that they're substantially different. I mean, there's not a lot of commonality, and that's not the subject of tonight's talk. What is the subject of tonight's talk is this. There are two bits, other than the very obvious Joseph to Jesus, that are the same, and that's Shealtiel and his son Zerubbabel. And it's Zerubbabel, and we've already given a bit of a hint because I said that what is that picture? Well, it's Zerubbabel's temple. So that's where we're going. That's what we're going to look at. And so in order to get some context around this, I just want to start thinking about what the temple was. Where did it fit into the Jewish worship? And I'm not going to go too much theology of it. We're going to skip over this quite quickly, but just to put a little bit of timeline context around. Okay, originally there was Moses. That was the first sort of formalized worship, as it were. Moses and the tabernacle, we know all of that from the Pentateuch. And following that, then Solomon's temple was constructed. And some of you thought that might have been Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was very grand. Zerubbabel's temple, by contrast, was not as grand. And soon after, Israel divided into two kingdoms. You know that? The northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. And the northern kingdom in about 720 BC was defeated. They themselves were taken into exile, and 10 tribes were scattered. And the two southern tribes, Benjamin and Judah, remained in the south, and they continued to worship at the temple until the time of the Babylonian exile. And when the Babylonian exile came up, of course, the temple was destroyed, and then in 516 BC, and we've already hinted some of the dates, the temple of Zerubbabel was completed, and worship started there. And then around about 19 BC, there was a very substantial remodeling, to the point that some people say Herod's temple. Some people just say it was still Zerubbabel's temple remodeled. But what is really, really important is that that temple was destroyed in AD 70, and then there are two kind of periods. There's the first temple period, the period in which Solomon's temple was there, and then there's the second temple period, and that's the period within which Zerubbabel's temple, which was heavily remodeled by Herod, but crucially, worship, sacrifices continued right through that time, even though the remodeling was extensive to say the least. They did not stop worship. So that is generally known as the Second Temple period. So that's kind of where that's a very high level, if you like, overview of the worship that Israel had and how they worshipped. But what we're going to really start to focus on is this Babylonian exile, because we're going to look at this second temple, Zerubbabel's temple, how it came to be there, how it came to be built, and what happened. And in order to do that, we just need to look at some of the events around that. So the first thing is that in 609, King Josiah died. Now, another one of my favorite characters. I could do a whole nother series on some of these, but Josiah, a wonderful character. But he got involved in an argument that wasn't his. They were having a war between the Persians and the Egyptians, and they came down the Mediterranean Sea. He went out there to try and sort of stop them and say, "Hey guys, stop fighting over my land." And the result was he got in the way and he ended up getting killed. Not a great way to die, but he was a reformer, but that was the start of really a downslide. Very much a start. We'll see that date is quite critical, as we'll see a bit later on. And after that, we had his son, we have not his son, there's a few others in between, but one of his sons, King Jehoiachin, in 597 was deposed. And that is another sort of fairly critical date, because he was then taken into exile himself, and subsequent to that, Jerusalem was sieged and fell. But the timeline for the exile that's given in Ezra and Ezekiel counts from that date, from the day that King Jehoiachin was deposed. But more on that one later as we just unpack a little bit of what the scriptures say. Yeah. And then in 586, Nebuzaradan, can't say this one, Nebuzaradan. I should have chosen one of Paul's letters, shouldn't I, without all the difficult names. He served under King Nebuchadnezzar as the captain of the guard. What did he do? He came to Jerusalem and he sacked the city. And the first temple, Solomon's temple, was in that year, 586, razed to the ground. So Solomon's temple ceased to exist, and at that point in time, The monarchy and all the institutions of of Judah and Benjamin, the southern kingdom of Israel, stopped. That was that. No more. And then the Jews were in exile. And there they stayed until 538. And we'll look at a little bit about some of the characters surrounding this shortly. When King Cyrus issued a decree that said the Jews could go back to Jerusalem. And in 520, they started to rebuild the temple, and in 516, then the temple was complete, and that was then finished. And the 70 years, Jeremiah, in more than one place, but I particularly picked up Jeremiah 29:10, prophesied 70 years. And I'm going to touch a little later on that, but I've put this timeline from when King Josiah died until the Jews started to return from Babylon. And I'll talk just a little bit about why later on. It's not the only option, but I believe it's the right option, and I will justify it shortly. But during their time in captivity, and just before, there were various prophets. So we have lots of biblical sources for the material that we're going to look at. There's Jeremiah, the prophet. Jeremiah, good old Jeremiah. Don't you love him? But he was heavily influenced by the events of this time as Jerusalem was being repeatedly sacked. And it wasn't sort of one day, the Babylonians turned up and everybody went into exile. It actually, as we will see, happened over a bit of a period of time. And indeed, the return happened over a bit of a period of time. And Jeremiah was prophesying and was sort of counsel to some of the kings during this time. Daniel, another person, another book of the Bible that was written during the time. And we will see again some of the characters that Daniel was meeting. But Daniel was taken to Babylon, and he was taken very early on, just after Josiah died, during the reign of his son. He went to Babylon. So very, very early, much before the time of the temple being destroyed and things. So quite early, Ezekiel and the Lamentations of Jeremiah were again both heavily influenced by the events of this time. And as we unpack, we can go back and we can look at those books. We see things that happened. And a book we're going to talk a lot about this evening, the book of Haggai. 2 chapters that pretty much covers 112 days. So guess where the 112 days is coming from. We can see where we're going. And then a number of psalms were written during this time. That's Haggai. A number of psalms. Of course, we all know, I think, Psalm 137. Yes? By the rivers of Babylon. Yes? Something of bony emeralds. Oh, no, I'm not going to sing. I'm not going to sing, honestly. Okay, that isn't one of my talents, but we know that one. That's very classically one of the psalms that was written as a lament in Babylon, but there were a lot more, and I've put quite a few of them up there, and also there were 5 psalms at the end, numbers 146 to 50, that were actually written for the dedication of the Second Temple. And if you look at them, you read them and think about, as you go and perhaps explore a little bit of your Bible, think about what I've said tonight, you look at them and think about the context, you'll see what the sort of praise they are about, sort of coming back and that sort of overflow of praise and worship that comes out as the temple is rededicated and worship is restored in Jerusalem. So that's some of the writers that were happening during the exile, okay? Probably the real scholars among you are going like, where's one of the other books? Well, it will come. It will come. Just briefly look at some of the kings of Israel that were at the time. We had Josiah, okay, as I said, died in battle. And then his son, Jehoahaz, lasted only 3 months, and he was deposed by the Pharaoh. Pharaoh Necho II. So Israel at this time, it wasn't just the Babylonians. You know, we often think of just the Babylonians, but actually when you start to unpack it and look, it's also the Egyptians. And as we will see later, it's not just the Babylonians, it's also the Persians. So there were a lot of enemies of Israel. There are a lot of people fighting over. And then we have quite an important chappie, Jehoiakim. Yeah? Now, he actually was appointed by Pharaoh Necho II. So, you know, we actually see that the Pharaoh, an external agency, was coming in and appointing rulers and leaders. I don't know where we've seen that in the world today. Possibly in Ukraine, I don't know. But it happened. It was happening then. And he was a bit of a character because he was appointed by the Pharaoh. Babylon wasn't very happy about it, so they attacked and he switched sides, and then he switched sides again, and he took a whole load of stuff from the treasury of the temple and he palmed it off to the Babylonians. And so he actually plundered the temple. A lot of the treasures were taken out during his reign. Jeremiah, extremely critical. Have a look at some of the stuff in Jeremiah where he's prophesying against Jehoiakim. But it wasn't the end. Babylon eventually got tired of him. They came, besieged the city yet again. I mean, there were plenty of sieges of Jerusalem, and he died during that siege. We don't know whether he died because of the siege or whether he just died during the siege, but he died during that siege. And then he was succeeded by Jehoiachin. He came to the throne in 598, and he did not last very long either. 3 months and 10 days to be precise. And he got taken off into exile. And that was on the 15th of March, 597 BC, or 15th, 16th of March, 597 BC. And he was exiled with his household and 3,000 people on that day. And it's from that day, 597 BC, that the exile is counted in Ezekiel and Ezra. And then, after that, we had the final king of Israel, the last one, reigned from 597 to 586. So this is against now an increasing turbulent backdrop. Yeah, he was made king by Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, you know, the Babylonians had come in already. We will talk a little bit about the kings of Babylon, or the rulers of Babylon, but he was 21 years old, but he was appointed by Nebuchadnezzar, not appointed by the Jews, appointed by a foreign power, as indeed Jehoahaz had been appointed by the Egyptians. So we see the sort of the turmoil. We're getting a real sense of the turmoil, the tragedy that was going on. And again, Jeremiah was his counselor, but it's recorded in Kings, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He clearly did not want to listen to Jeremiah. In the end, he got fed up with the Babylonians. He revolted against them. And that was not a good move because he was taken, his sons were all killed, his eyes were put out, and he was carted off. And it was at that point that the remainder of the temple was destroyed, and the remainders of whatever valuables that Jehoiakim had left were taken off into Babylon. So, finally, I just want to bring up, forgot that one, 2 options for the 70 years. And the scholars have proposed both of these. The one, option A, and the one that I'm going to propose in a minute is correct, is the one from just shortly after Josiah died to when the Jews started to come back, when Cyrus issued his decree to say they could come back. But there is a second option, which is that from the fall of the temple, so when the temple was destroyed until the temple worship was restarted. However, it does say that in Ezra, that the initial return of the Jews in 538 fulfilled the prophecy of Jeremiah. And it is for that reason that I believe that the 70 years should go from the earlier date. And there is good evidence for that. If you look in the book of Daniel, right at the start, we see that Daniel himself was taken into captivity during the reign of Jehoiakim. So very shortly after Josiah had died. So there's good evidence for that. And biblically, it's stated that in Ezra. But some people will look to say later. Take your pick, but I believe it's the former. Briefly, very, very briefly, because otherwise we'll run completely out of time, and I will finish by 7 o'clock, I promise. The Babylonian kings, the very first one was a chap called Nabopolassar. He founded the empire, but shortly after that came one that we probably much more recognize, Nebuchadnezzar the Great. Regarded as probably the greatest of the Babylonian kings, famous for his campaigns. And of course, when we think of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and the architecture of Babylon, it's Nebuchadnezzar that instituted a lot of that. And of course, we read a lot about Nebuchadnezzar. He keeps popping up in Daniel and other places. So certainly someone who we will meet in the Bible as we look through. Followed by this chap, Marduk. Doesn't appear much, except that it was he who, after Jehoiachin had been in captivity for 37 years, released him. So that's his little biblical claim to fame. Followed by a chap called Neriglissar. Yeah. Not particularly important for our purposes. He mostly dealt with Turkey. And then a chap called Labashi Marduk. He was quite young, and he was soon deposed by Belshazzar. Now, that's another name we'll probably recognize, yeah, from Daniel. So, and then finally, the last Babylonian king is this chap, Nabonidus. And he was put on the throne by Belshazzar. He was not of the royal line. It was very unclear as to why Belshazzar thought he should come to the throne, but he did. His little claim to fame, he was often regarded as the world's first archaeologist. He was very interested in looking into the past. But then he was followed, not as the ruler of the Babylonians, but by a Persian, because the Babylonian Empire in itself was taken over by Cyrus. And at that time, by the time he took over Babylon, was taking over a massive area, all the way from the Indus River in the east, right the way through to the area around the Dardanelles. So that's modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. And in fact, after he died, he went even further. I mean, remember, at this time, we're talking about the rise of the Greek state. So, we were almost beginning to get the east versus west, Greece coming into the equation, and there were quite a few standoffs there later. But Cyrus, very important, because he had a good heart. And one of his things as he went through was he tried to allow people to restore their customs, their traditions, and importantly, their religion. And as we look into the biblical record shortly, I'm doing a lot of talking, trust me, we do have some readings. As we look into the biblical record, we'll see that Cyrus really came to the good. And to the point that in Isaiah 45, verse 1, we read that God anointed Cyrus. You've heard him as his anointed one. And he is the only non-Jew, and I'm pleased with all you scholars, I stand to be corrected, but he's the only non-Jew to whom that designation is given in the Bible. The anointed one, Cyrus, the only non-Jew. Isaiah 45, verse 1. He also, incidentally, another little lovely one, has given us the first declaration that we have of a Charter of Human Rights. That still exists. followed by a chap called Cambyses II, Bardia, and then Darius the Great. And Darius the Great we will pause at because he's another very important one. He actually overthrew Bardia to come to the throne, so there was a little bit of bloodshed and rivalry. And he was the one that expanded the empire right the way through into Greece, and he actually had arguments with the city-state of Athens and with Thrace and others. So, but something else he did, and something else that's quite important as we really delve into the scriptures later. And just think too, when I say this, that the book of Daniel was written in Aramaic, not Hebrew. And Darius established Aramaic as a second official language for the whole of the Persian Empire. So, of course, the Babylonians have become the Persian Empire. So there were two official languages, Persian and Aramaic. Daniel was written in Aramaic. There are even portions in the New Testament that are in Aramaic, and when we know that our Lord spoke Aramaic. That's a leftover from this time. So we see the history starting to come together and things happening. And then a couple of other just very... What happened there? Oh, I missed a couple. Okay, Xerxes, is referenced in Esther, and then Artaxerxes is referenced in Nehemiah. Just two more kings that pop up in the Bible. And then, so they're the kind of like the really important ones. Cyrus, Nebuchadnezzar, and Darius. They're the ones we need to just kind of keep a hold on. Coming back, the return timeline. Yeah? So, Zerubbabel returned in 538, and the temple was rebuilt in 521 to 516. We'll touch on shortly why there was such a gap. Ezra returned much, much later, 458. And I said to you earlier, the going into captivity was a time, it took place over quite a time. Well, we see here, so did the return. 538, Cyrus said, you may come back. But it took, until 458, a lot of years later, 80 years later, before Ezra returned. And, of course, even more surprisingly, Nehemiah. I think there was a point in my Christian history, I said, well, Nehemiah was wonderful. He must have come rushing back and rebuilding the walls. Actually, it took him the better part of 100 years before he came back. Now, I'm not knocking Nehemiah, and I'm going to talk just at the end briefly about, touch on that. But, it did take quite a long time. And then there's a couple of books and things. Obviously, Malachi was written right at the end. During this time, we had the book of Haggai we've touched on. Zechariah. Now, we're not quite sure. We 520 to 460-ish maybe. No one really knows. So we know it started about 520. It's a bit dubious where the end point is. The book of Esther, of course, written during that. And you'll probably recognize already some of the kings and that names that we've touched on from the book of Esther. And the one that I didn't say before, Ezra. And of course, a very key book. For all you students, you know that Ezra has a lot. And I didn't put Ezra before because Ezra was written here, but it's a historical book. It actually records a lot of events. So a lot of what went on in our 112 days we will find, and we're going to read shortly a little bit from Ezra. The book of Nehemiah. And again, just a little fascinating thing. There's something, to be honest, I didn't know this. Everyone's going to say, well, of course you knew this. Did you know that until around about the 13th century in the Paris Bible, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah were one? And they sort of gradually got split, and then when the Paris Bible in the 13th century, as recently as that was published, they got split into two books. So, all those people who think, we got sort of 37 books in the Old Testament, 37, 3 7s are 21, and 20, whoops, it doesn't quite work out like that, because unfortunately, there were originally only 65 books and, 30, so yeah. It's 39, not 37, but yes. Quite recent. I didn't know, but they kind of follow on. When you read them, you sort of realize that they really are just following on. So that's, and then finally, of course, Malachi. So, Malachi was written quite soon after all these events, really. I mean, it's not that long, especially when you consider that Nehemiah had only returned in 445 and Malachi around about 432. So only 13 years or so later. And indeed, Nehemiah himself came back twice, because the first time he came back, he rebuilt the walls, and then he had to come back again and sort them out, because the Jews had again drifted off and stopped being so devout. So let's briefly look at the ancestry of Zerubbabel, and then we'll have done with the background. You'll be happy to know. This was the sort of the historical things. They're all on the same page. So we get to here. Jehoiachin was taken captive. He had a son, Shealtiel, who we will come across, who had a son, Zerubbabel. Well, that's if you read Haggai, and if you read Ezra, and indeed if you look into Matthew and Luke. If you look into 1 Chronicles 3 verse 19, you'll find that his father was Pedaiah. Well, how does that come about? Well, thank you, Chris, for last week for explaining about the kinsman redeemer. So it's quite likely that as Shealtiel and Pedaiah were brothers, maybe Shealtiel had a wife, died, yeah. And so, although the lineage is recorded as his, yeah, in fact, biologically, it's Pedaiah's. That would be a rational and reasonable explanation for that difference. Okay, one just important point, yeah? Jeremiah 22:30, prophecy. None of his, that's Jehoiachin's offspring, will prosper. None will sit on the throne of David or rule anymore in Judah. So we see here that Zerubbabel was of the royal line. He could have been king. No reason for him not to have been king. But he did not become king. And so it would appear that the populace in general took Jeremiah's prophecy very seriously. He became a governor, but not a king. So that prophecy was fulfilled, has been fulfilled. Yeah. So, end of that, end of the history part. And now I just want to start to look at some scriptures. There's quite a bit, and then at the end of that, I just want to pick up one or two points and just conclude. So we start in Ezra. Sorry, my companion's going to do that out. So we're going to start this in Ezra 3. Yeah. So we first meet them as they. If you can have that first slide, the next slide, please. Thanks. Yeah. So we meet them as they are coming back from Babylon. We think the year is probably 537. Because it's recorded as being in the month of Tishri. If it was in 538 when the decree was issued, it sort of wouldn't have been enough time to physically get the decree out and to get them back. Ezra recalled some of the distance and time, about 2.5 months. So it's likely to be 537. Even been suggested it's 536. So we're now at about 537. So Ezra 3 says that that Joshua, son of Zodek, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates, began to build the altar of God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses. So, just skipping forward a little bit into Ezra 3, we see that on the first day of the 7th month, so this would be the following year, so presuming it was 37, this would be 36, about the 19th of April, 536, they began to offering burnt offerings to the Lord through the foundation of the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. So at this time they hadn't started the temple. Then they gave money to the masons and carpenters and gave food and drink and olive oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre so that they would bring cedar logs from Lebanon to Joppa as authorized by Cyrus, king of Persia. And Cyrus had offered to pay for the rebuilding. The anointed one, the non-Jew king, had offered to pay for the rebuilding of the temple. So in the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, and the rest of the people returned from captivity, began the work. And so moving on to chapter 4, and then when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the family and said, "Let us help you build it, because we, like you, seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria." And please note here that large-scale movements of people around the world at this time were not uncommon. There's another one who brought us here. But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the family of Israel, you have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord our God, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us. And then the people around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. And they bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And the next record that we have is in Ezra, when the temple building appears to have actually started. And it talks about a prophecy. We know this is from what happened in Haggai. This is Haggai. So Haggai prophesied. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, son of Zodek, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God, Haggai, were with them, supporting them. At that time, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bazanai and their associates went to them and asked, "Who authorized you to rebuild this temple and to finish it?" They also asked, "What are the names of those who are constructing this building?" Oops. Sounds a bit like, "We're going to tell teacher about you." And then follows, and I'm not going to read the whole of this, it's Ezra 5 and 6, a beautiful set. I mean, I commend you, go back after this and read them. It's beautiful. It's a letter written to Darius, and it basically says, sort of, "Please, Gov, is this actually allowed for this to happen?" And when Darius gets the letter, he sends his officials off and says, "Well, go and find out what Cyrus said." And so they go off and they find a scroll or a roll that Cyrus had written that said he'd permitted, or in fact he'd instructed the temple to be rebuilt and to fund it. And then they write a letter back and say, "Yes, it's fine. You know, this is kosher. This is good. You are permitted to build the temple." So we've got to move on now to Haggai. So Haggai chapter 1, and we'll go through, hopefully quite quickly through this, but in the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, so that's 29th of August, 520 BCE. So 520, August, this is the start of 112 days. The word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, blah, 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 the high priest. "This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house." Then the word came through the prophet Haggai. "Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled house while this house remains a ruin? Now, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You've planted much but harvested little. You eat but never have enough. You drink but never have your fill. You put on clothes but you are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty? Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. Jackie, can we just skip forward to slide 38, please, down to chapter 2. So there's a little bit more of that prophecy, but then in Haggai 2, it says, in the second year of King Darius, on the 21st day of the 7th month, so this is the 17th of October, 520, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, to Joshua, the high priest, and the remnant. Ask them, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? But now be strong, Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, Joshua, son of Zodek, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted you with when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear. And then jumping forward to the end of that same chapter, so that's actually the end of the book of Haggai, we read, the word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. That's the 18th of December, 520. Tell Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, that I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the powers of the foreign kingdoms. I will overthrow chariots and their drivers, horses and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his brother. On that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will take you, my servant Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I will make you like my, I can see my scholars are going, my signet ring. For I have chosen you, declares the Lord Almighty. So, a couple of other references, just briefly. There's 1 Chronicles 2, Nehemiah 12 and Ezra 2 just record Zerubbabel as being among the returning exiles, and Zechariah 4, which we haven't read, but we will return to shortly. So, that's the scriptures I want to read. Hopefully we've picked up a few of the people. Now I just want, in the remaining very few minutes, and it will be a very few minutes, I just want to pick up a couple of points that I've been challenged by. And I hope that as I present them to you, that the Lord will speak to you through these. So the first of all, there was a plan. Come on, am I going to hear it? God has... There was a plan. And what's more, when I saw that it said you have planted much. Actually, that's the same root. If you plant something, you've got a plan. You've got a plan for it to grow. So, a work that is planted, yeah? We saw there's some places, particularly, and I'm going to pick up very briefly, Babylon and Jerusalem. And there was pleasure. So, for I know the plans I have for you. Now, often people refer to this as an individual, but we know from Jeremiah 29:10 that was spoken to Israel because it prophesied the 70 years in captivity. The very next verse says, for I know the plans I have for you, for Israel. It's a corporate whole, yeah? I know the plans to prosper you and so forth, yeah? Zerubbabel likely knew this verse. I mean, he knew Jeremiah. Jeremiah was his counselor. So Zerubbabel knew there was a plan, but yet he got distracted. People came and, he got knocked off course for some 20-odd years before it took Haggai to come to him and say, oi, come on, the Lord says. Yeah? It's easy. We may have plans, but it's easy to get knocked off track. Very, very, very easy. Yeah? And then there are some places. Do you know, the exiles were in the wrong place. The plan was for them to come back to Jerusalem. Where were they? They were in Babylon. It took Nehemiah the better part of 100 years. It took Ezra 80 years to come back. They were in the wrong place. They got so comfortable in the place that they had been taken, they forgot to go to the place they should be. They weren't meant to be in Babylon. They were meant to be in Jerusalem. In fact, they were meant to be in Jerusalem, building the temple and worshiping. And, as we read from Nehemiah and other places, not only did they come back, then they fell away again and again. And thank you, Chris, again for your sermon on Sunday. Elijah, a good example of this. He ran away. Fortunately, God still had a plan to get him back on course, but he ran away. He went to the wrong place. He wasn't meant to be by the brook. Isn't it easy to get discouraged? We see here, this sort of pattern of discouragement and revival, and it's easy as we go on to be discouraged. But there's a pleasure. The pleasure is that to build the house for God's pleasure. And actually, they were starting off to build their own paneled houses. But the instruction was to build the temple for God's pleasure, not their own houses. We need to build the church. And my question is, are we building the church for God's pleasure? 6 times in the Bible, it has this phrase, give careful thought. Give careful thought. The first 5 are all in Haggai. Give careful thought to your ways. We read those. There were 3 references we didn't read, just further down, but give careful thought. But in Proverbs it says, give careful thought to the paths for your feet, and be steadfast in all your ways. My little challenge tonight, is that what we're doing? Am I indeed giving careful thought to my ways? And then finally, there's the signet ring for Zerubbabel. It's a sign of togetherness. It's a sign that, Rebecca was given a ring to claim her as a bride, as Isaac's bride. It's a sign of authority. If you have the signet ring, you can set seals, you can send edicts, you can change commands. To have the signet ring, it's very important. It was a very important sign. And Zerubbabel became, or was told to be, the Lord's signet ring. So, very importantly, and this perhaps becomes sort of where you get super spiritual in a sense, this signet ring re-established the Davidic line. And we see that most importantly when we get to the genealogies. That's where we started in Matthew and Luke, when we see Zerubbabel is within those genealogies. And so, to end, 112 days that changed the world. 29th of August to the 18th of December, 520. This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. I've now given the context. Hopefully we have some context around this verse. Not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord Almighty. Are we building our church with those? Not by might, nor by power, but by His Spirit. I give you Zerubbabel, governor, prince, the Lord's signet ring. Thank you.